I'm going to tell you the worst case I've ever seen. The one you'll compare your nightmare cases to from now on, because this one had everything: a committed caregiver, a skilled trainer, a successful plan. And still, the dog was surrendered. Here's what you're going to take away from this episode. 1, how to make sure this doesn't happen to you. 2, the 14 principles that decide whether you win or lose the case. 3, the mistakes even professionals make when they're focused on fixing the dog and just hoping for the best with the human caregiver. 4, how to use the human change architecture, HCA, to elevate your case outcomes. So if you ever wondered, why did everything we built just fall apart? Stay with me. This is the one that explains it. Chapter 1, the case that should have worked. Jasmine adopted a dog named Remy, a rescue with some behavioral history, but nothing unmanageable. She worked with a practitioner, Taylor, who was force-free, skilled, and thorough. They had a strong intake process, a plan mapped out. Jasmine followed instructions. Taylor adjusted as needed. For the first few weeks, things were improving. But around week 5, things started to slip. Updates got shorter, engagements dropped. A few check-ins were missed. Jasmine still said she was doing the work, but something had shifted. Then Jasmine emailed, "I think I'm over my head. I might need to return him." Taylor was stunned. There had been no crisis, no aggression spike. The dog had made progress, but the human system had collapsed. And it left Taylor asking, what did I miss? Chapter 2, the human change architecture. Here's where most professionals have no map, or worse, they're using a map built for simple changes, not complex systems. Like trying to remodel a bathroom with a hammer. Human change architecture, HCA, is that map. It's built on natural laws, not techniques, not tools, and certainly not tips and tricks. It draws from organizational psychology, system dynamics, neuroscience, and trauma science, not as a source, but as a confirming lens. Oh, by the way, HCA isn't mine. I didn't invent the principles. They're laws, natural ones. I simply applied them to real-world problems of human change in behavior work. When we don't use them, well, cases collapse. Not loudly, quietly. It's a slow disengagement, silent withdrawals, burnout, and surrender. So in this next section, I'm going to walk you through all 14 principles. Each one includes what happened in the case, the signals it showed in Jasmine or Taylor, why it mattered, what happens when it's missing, and a reflection question for you. If you're listening live, you can type in your answers in the chat. And if not, jot them down. You'll want to think about this the next time a case of yours starts to wobble. This full chapter takes about 50 minutes to go through. Take a breath. This is the part that changes how you work. Principle 1, containment. The buffer that helps stress. When Jasmine's work schedule changed, her communication slowed down. Her messages, when they did come, got shorter. Then she missed 2 sessions with polite, curt notes mentioning life issues. They might have been true, but her baseline was someone who would have protected the time, right? What you might have noticed in your cases is when longer delays between check-ins happen. Increase in excuses like, we're just busy lately. a subtle drop in tone, warmth, or responsiveness. These are human signals, not vocalized as stress, but visible as retreat. We're trained to read the dog's body language, right? But this is how we learn to read the humans. What's happening when containment is missing, that principle containment? Well, shame builds quietly. Progress becomes a burden. People stop telling the truth about how they're doing. And the outcomes we promised, well, they collapse. What this principle suggests is to plan for the wobble. Don't wait for it. Don't hope it doesn't happen, because it will. And that might mean scheduling planned light weeks around known stressors, or giving permission to pause and still stay in the process. Logging caregiver stress alongside the dog's behavior, right? So here's your reflection question. Where have you seen a caregiver pull away quietly before things failed? How would you build containment next time? Not as a rescue plan, but by design. Okay, principle 2, shared ownership. This is a good one because I often see this happening. The load has to be carried by at least 2. So let me tell you the story. As things began to shift, Jasmine didn't reach out to rework the plan. She just quietly pulled back. She stopped giving updates. She stopped asking questions. Taylor reacted by piling on more support, hoping Jasmine would re-engage. But all of it still came from one side. Jasmine wasn't helping holding the plan anymore. She was disappearing under it. What you might have seen. You're doing all the thinking, tracking, adjusting. Or the caregiver starts repeating your ideas with no energy. I guess we'll try that. Their tone becomes resigned, obedient, not engaged. It's like you've given them a prescription as opposed to something that you're going to work on together. They follow a script, not shaping the work at all. These are signs of imbalance. The caregiver is no longer a co-creator. They've become an implementer of something they don't believe will work or no longer want to fight for. And some caregivers are holding on to a quiet belief. If this is about the dog and I've hired a pro and it still doesn't work, then it's not about me, it's him, right? Okay, we rarely get clear dropouts. We get handoffs from shared effort to professional responsibility. What this principle suggests is to co-create sooner. That means involving the caregiver in threshold mapping from day one, asking what they're able and willing to help carry, giving up some expert control and inviting real-time feedback. So in reflection, think about this. When in your past cases were you the one holding the vision alone? What would it look like to share that vision? So it's co-owned, not just followed. Okay, on to principle 3, relational commitment, the safety that holds trust. So in this principle, things started to slip and Jasmine kept doing the work, but Taylor knew something felt off. Have you ever experienced that? Taylor noticed that the tasks were completed, but there was no questions, no curiosity. Jasmine wasn't showing up as a person anymore, just a performer. What you might have seen. The caregiver shows up perfectly, but emotionally absent. You get follow through, but not connection. And sense there's a distance, but the behavior logs that they send in look fine. Here's what's really happening. The caregiver has stopped feeling safe in the process. It's true. And they're going through the motions because they think they should, not because they trust the outcome. The moment a problem arises, They disappear. And you realize too late the things you were tracking wasn't the things breaking. So this principle says, don't track compliance, track connection. And that means looking for emotional cues, not just behavior logs like emails that they're sending in. Make space for fear, doubt, frustration, not just progress. Ask, are you still okay? And really listen. Okay, here's your reflection questions. Have you ever watched a case crumble even though the client was doing everything? And then, if you did, what signals did you miss? Okay, principle 4, readiness, the structure that protects the work. So let's go back to the story. Jasmine gets a promotion. Great. But it came with more hours, less flexibility, and more emotional load. She said she could still do the work, but the evidence suggested otherwise. First, there were 2 videos that she was supposed to submit to you, and they were missed. The emails stopped. Then 2 canceled sessions. But the plan stayed the same. Taylor adjusted. She simplified the task. She lightened the steps, but no one paused to ask, do we still have the structure to hold this? Because readiness had changed, but no one said it. What you might have noticed is things like a client says yes, but doesn't shift their life, right? You ask for 20 minutes a day and they give you 3. They're still committed, but nothing else makes room for the work. This is the law of readiness. Behavioral success depends on real-world capacity, not enthusiasm. Readiness is not a one-time green light. It's a structure, and it must be revisited. Without it, the plan becomes a quiet gamble, and the plan breaks, not because it was flawed, but because it was under-resourced. When readiness is missing, here's what happens. The dog gets blamed. The practitioner gets questioned. The caregiver gets overwhelmed, and the whole thing collapses. Like baking a 3-tiered cake without the ingredients, oven space, or time. What this principle suggests is to start by defining thresholds, like asking, what will you need to stop doing to make this work? What will this take from your week? And are you okay with that? What's our pause protocol if readiness disappears? And yes, this includes medication. If a dog is being put on medication, you have to plan for that pause. A dog can't benefit from meds if the human isn't ready to track, adjust, and lead. And meds don't remove the need for readiness. They increase the stakes of ignoring it. So here's some reflection questions for you. Did you ever clearly define what success would require, hour by hour? And when the client's capacity shifted, did you ask again? Did you revisit it? Okay, let's move on to the next principle, which is nonlinearity, the path that bends without breaking. In our story, Jasmine had just come off a strong week. Remy had 3 quiet walks, no lunging, no barking, even passed another dog with only a glance. Taylor praised the progress. They agreed to step things up. Let's add a few more triggers. Let's shorten the distance. Let's increase the exposure. Then, the very next week, Remy barked through every walk, started pacing again, refused food. So Jasmine's face during the next check-in said everything. She looked embarrassed, like she'd done something wrong, and she said, I thought we were past this. But they weren't past it. They were just experiencing the shape of change, and no one had prepared her for it. So what you might have noticed in your own cases. A caregiver starts strong, then hits a dip and thinks the plan has failed. They start apologizing for going backwards. And you sense they're demoralized, but you haven't given them language for what's happening. Or maybe you increase the challenge right after a win and everything unravels. This isn't a planning error. It's a natural misunderstanding of how change moves. Because human systems crave linearity, but behavior change isn't linear. It loops, it dips, it pauses, and it spirals. And if you don't design for that, people will believe they failed when they are actually in motion. This is the natural law of non-linearity. Progress doesn't mean past the problem. It means we're moving through the pattern. And the system, dog and human, needs to be allowed to dip, slow down, or even regress without penalty. When nonlinearity is ignored, the caregiver collapses under false expectations. They assume success should climb, and they interpret the dip as failure. And they quietly detach when it stops feeling like forward motion. You'll hear things like, I thought we were done with this. I guess we're back at square one. I don't know what else to do. What's breaking isn't their capacity, it's their hope. And what this principle suggests instead is you have to shape expectations early, and you have to embed pauses and regressions into the logic of your plan. That means normalizing cycles. Every case has dips. We just need to know how to move through it. Visualizing change as patterned, not straight. Saying out loud, we'll go backwards, and that won't mean we failed. Logging dips as data, not as a derailment. Because once people expect the bend, they're less likely to break when it comes. So here's your reflection questions. Have you ever had a client disengage because progress reversed? What would it have changed if they had known what to expect? Here's one thing you can do. At the start of a case, say this. This plan will move forward, then it will dip, then it will pick up again. And that's not a problem. It's a cycle. Let's make sure we track the rhythm, not the steps. Because if they believe every backslide is a failure, you'll lose them inside of a normal curve. Okay, on to principle 6, clarity of feedback. The mirror that keeps change visible. Okay, so back to the story. Jasmine was trying. You could see it. She showed up for sessions. She sent the videos, but her emails were starting to trail off into questions she didn't want to ask out loud. Things like, is this what we're supposed to be seeing? Does it still count if he barked at the end? Are we still on track? And Taylor, trying to keep things positive, kept saying, he's doing well, you're doing great, which was true, but it wasn't enough because Jasmine wasn't asking for praise. She was asking for a map, and she wasn't getting one. What you might have noticed in your own cases is the caregiver keeps doing the work, but seems less sure it's working. They stop bringing questions and start waiting for confirmations. You notice progress, but you haven't named the criteria that defines it. You get the sense they're watching your face for clues. These are the moments where feedback becomes a holding structure. And if it isn't clear, the client loses orientation. This is the natural law of clarity of feedback. So change needs mirrors, and not just any mirror, one that shows what matters, why it matters, and whether it's working. When feedback is vague, people fill in the blanks, usually with self-doubt. When clarity of feedback is missing, you get compliance, but without confidence. The caregiver does what you ask, but doesn't know why. And they don't know what counts. And they can't tell you they're on track and how far they've come. This is where motivation fades, not because they've lost interest, but because they've lost meaning. What this principle suggests instead, Make success visible, make effort measurable, and make sure you know when they're doing it right, not just when you do. That might mean setting 2 or 3 reference points in advance. Here's what success might look after 3 weeks. Giving feedback that is framed through their effort and the dog's process, not just outcomes. Explaining how you're measuring progress so they know what you're watching. Saying, this moment here, that head turn, that's a green flag. It tells us something's working. Because vague feedback is easy to ignore, but specific repeated feedback becomes its own form of containment. Here's your reflection questions. Are you ready? Can your clients tell, without asking, when they're doing something right? And if not, who's holding the map? Here's one thing you can do. The next time you review a video or an in-person moment, narrate exactly what you see and why it matters. Say, right here, when he looks away and softens his mouth, that's a shift, and you helped it happen. Then pause. Let them absorb that it wasn't random. It was structured, it was timing, and it was them. Okay, principle 7, belief integrity. The story the client tells himself when things get hard. Let me go back to the story again. By week 9, Jasmine had done everything Taylor asked. She follows the protocols. She tracked behavior. She even made small wins. But the week things dipped. She didn't say she was struggling. She said, I don't think I'm cut out for this. Not, I don't think the plan is right. Or this week was hard. What she blamed was herself. And from that point on, it didn't matter how much progress Remy had made. Jasmine was already internalized that she was the problem, that it wasn't working because she wasn't enough. What you might have noticed in your own case is things like the caregiver starts using language like, I must be doing it wrong, or I'm just not good at this. They stop tracking progress and they start tracking their own perceived failure. They try to reframe it, but they're no longer open to hearing it. You sense they're no longer measuring behavior, they're measuring themselves. This is what happens when belief integrity fractures. The story they tell themselves about their worth, capability, or identity no longer supports the plan. This is the natural law of belief integrity. If the internal story collapses, the internal plan won't hold because no one stays committed to a path they've already decided they're failing at. When belief integrity is missed, you start seeing emotional withdrawal before behavioral withdrawal. Clients stop celebrating wins. They reject your praise. They show up with quiet posture of someone already bracing for failure. You'll hear, I thought I could do this. It's probably just me. Oh, this always happens. It becomes harder to talk to them into progress than to help them build it, because progress no longer fits the story they're holding. And what this principle suggests instead is you have to protect the internal narrative as deliberately as you protect the behavior plan. That means naming wins in terms of client's agency, not just outcomes. Interrupting shame spirals early. Asking open questions that affirm capabilities, such as, what part of this worked because of something you did? Holding space when the client says, I'm failing. And responding with something like, or you're overloaded. Let's separate the plan from your identity for a moment. Because the plan might be correct, but if the belief is broken, it still won't hold. So here's your reflection question. Think of a caregiver you've worked with who gave up early. What beliefs were they holding about themselves at the time? And did your plan leave space to talk about it? Here's one thing you can do. At your next intake or midpoint review, ask, what do you think this process is asking of you? And how are you feeling about that? Because until you hear the belief underneath the behavior, you don't really know what's holding the system together. Principle 8, pacing, the rhythm that prevents collapse. So back to our story. After a solid week of wins, Taylor suggests they increase the challenges. Remy had been calm around other dogs. Barking had dropped. Jasmine seemed hopeful again. So they shortened distances, added one new location, and they upped the reps. And within 3 days, Jasmine emailed. Remy was back to barking at every dog. He refused walks. And Jasmine, already doubting herself, wrote, I think I pushed him too far. I messed it up. But she didn't mess it up. The plan lost rhythm. They had stepped forward without resting. They scaled before stabilizing, and the system, both dog and human, couldn't hold it. What you might have noticed in your own cases is you see progress and assume it means ready for more. You change the challenge level and everything backslides. The caregiver seems optimistic one week, then flat and ashamed the next. You sense that neither of you has built-in breathing room. That this is not a problem of difficulty. It's a problem of tempo. This is the natural law of pacing. Change, especially in complex systems, has to be rhythmic, not stacked. Okay? So if we don't honor the nervous system's need for consolidation, we turn progress into pressure. The pressure breaks the system. When pacing is missing, caregivers feel like the bar keeps moving. The dog loses that reliability. The relationship between caregiver and plan becomes strained. You see rapid rise followed by sudden dips and then a prolonged stall. Clients say things like, I thought we were good, but then everything fell apart. We were doing so well, I don't know what happened. Well, what happened is we didn't rest before we reached. What this principle suggests instead is progress isn't just about the steps we take, it's about the pauses we plan. That means naming rest weeks as part of the plan, not a fallback. Saying, let's give the nervous system time to stabilize here. Tracking how much change has been absorbed and not just how much has been achieved. I call this saturation of change. Protecting the win phase by stretching it, not rushing past it. Because pacing isn't about going slow, it's about going sustainably. Yeah? Okay, here's your reflection questions. You ready? When you've seen a caregiver crash after success, was it because the plan failed or because the rhythm wasn't held? And here's one thing you can do. Really simple. Add a rest checkpoint to your protocols. Say, every 3 sessions forward, we pause. You maintain and breathe. Just give yourself breathing room. It's not about going easy. It's about building change with scaffolding, not speed. Okay, principle 9, recovery protocol, the path back after things go wrong. Back to our story. So Remy bit someone. It wasn't severe. It was a snapping and retreat moment in an apartment vestibule. Still, it shook Jasmine. She texted Taylor the next morning, said she was devastated, of course, said she didn't sleep, and ended with, I don't know what to do next. Taylor responded gently, validated her stress, suggested reviewing the plan and going back to basics. But Jasmine didn't respond because the rupture had already happened and there was no structure in place for return. The plan had goals, it had steps, but it didn't have a re-entry point for when things went wrong. What you might have noticed in your own cases is a serious behavioral event occurs and everything pauses. The caregiver goes silent. You offer support, but nothing really restarts. You sense they're not ignoring you. They're ashamed or afraid. This isn't disinterest. This is collapse without a bridge. They want to come back, but they don't know how. This is the natural law of recovery. Every system needs a way back, not just for when progress stalls, but for when ruptures occur. If people don't know how to return, they will stay gone, even when they still want help. When a recovery protocol is missing, you'll see things like the caregiver disappearing. The plan quietly dies. You don't get closure. You get confusion. And the case ends in silence. You hear things like, it just didn't work out. Oh, they ghosted me. We lost momentum and never got it back, or things like that. But what you actually lost was the structure that allowed rupture to be named, normalized, and re-entered. What this principle suggests instead is that recovery must be designed before the rupture happens. That means having a pre-agreed pause and repair plan. Saying early in the process, if something hard happens, a bite, a big regression, a shutdown, here's how we're going to come back together. Giving the client emotional permission to return without needing to justify the break. Designing a gentle restart. Fewer asks, shorter sessions, more holding space. Because re-engagement is more likely when the bridge back already exists. So here's your reflection question. Think about the last case that disappeared after rupture. Did you have a return path in place? Or were you and they left improvising in the dark? Here's one thing you can do. Add a rupture statement to your onboarding, right? So every case wobbles. Sometimes things go sideways. If that happens, we've got you. But I want you to know there's always a way back. There's always a recovery, and we'll map it together. Because people aren't afraid of failure. They're afraid of failing alone. Measure fidelity. The precision that makes meaning stick. So back to our story. Jasmine logged the walks. She uploaded the videos. She even filled out the behavior chart Taylor had created. Everything was being tracked. But here's what wasn't. Jasmine's sleep. Her sense of being overwhelmed. The fact that she hadn't smiled in the last 2 sessions. The way she paused before answering every question. Taylor was watching Remy's recovery arc, but Jasmine's system? It wasn't being measured. And that meant that most important risk signals, the ones that would later predict the collapse, went unnoticed. But you might have noticed in your own cases these things. You've got great notes on behavior, but nothing about the client's energy, emotion, or bandwidth. The dog's data looks stable, but the caregiver seems more and more disconnected. You rely on checklists and videos, but something in your gut, you know what I mean, says the case is drifting. You realize too late that the things breaking wasn't on the tracker. This isn't about poor record keeping. It's about partial visibility. This is the natural law of measurement fidelity. What you measure shapes what you respond to. If your data only includes the dog, you will miss the system collapse already underway in the human. When measurement fidelity is missing, the picture looks clean until it doesn't. The data says doing well, but the relationship says otherwise. Progress gets overstated, risk gets understated. The crash feels sudden, but you didn't have a dashboard for anything but surface level change. You'll hear, I thought things were fine. I didn't see it coming. It was going so well until it wasn't. But the signs were there. They just weren't being counted. So what this principle suggests instead is to design your measurement system to match your whole case logic. not just your method. That means including emotional, logistical, and relationship indicators alongside behavioral data, naming upfront what human side patterns signal fatigue, avoidance, or breakdown. Naming upfront when human side patterns signal fatigue, avoidance, or breakdown. Logging context, not just compliance. Asking questions like, how was your energy during this task? Did anything about this exercise feel heavier than it should have? Because what gets tracked becomes what gets protected. Okay, here's your reflection questions. Are you ready? What parts of your past cases weren't being measured that in hindsight were already falling apart? And here's one thing you can do. Add a line to your weekly cases review that asks, what isn't in the notes? What is starting to show up? If you find yourself saying, they seem a little off lately, this is the data. Track it. Okay, principle 11, governance, the agreement that holds everything. Back to our story. In week 10, Jasmine had grown quiet again. The protocol was still being followed technically. Videos were coming in, exercises were getting logged, but in their 10th check-in, she opened the call with this. I think I'd like to end early. It doesn't feel like we've gotten anywhere, and I'd like a refund for the last 2 sessions. Taylor didn't panic. She didn't defend. She didn't shut down. She opened the file and gently said, let's go back to what we agreed to measure and how we said we'd review it when things got hard. They opened the metrics. Remy's recovery time had dropped from 48 hours to somewhere between 30 to 60 minutes. Night wakings had stopped. 3 out of 5 triggers no longer caused an emotional surge. Jasmine herself had gone from avoiding the street to walking past dogs with a script and a plan. But Jasmine couldn't see it because what she was feeling was tired. What she was grieving was how hard it felt. What she had forgotten was what they had said they'd track and what they said they'd expect. So Taylor opened the agreement, the one they'd both reviewed at the start, the one that laid out what progress would mean in a complex case, what the structure of the plan required in time, energy, and adaptation, what to do if emotional readiness dropped, and yes, what the refund policy was. Jasmine paused. She didn't fight it. She just said, I guess I didn't realize how much was actually working. And they agreed to keep going, but lighter and slower because the structure had held. Now, what you might have noticed in your own cases is a client says they feel like nothing's changed, but you've seen the shifts. You get a refund request or a sudden withdrawal, and they show up late in the program. You realize they've drifted from the shared framework and you have no common ground to stand on. You feel tempted to either defend or retreat. This is where governance becomes your stability, not to enforce, but to recall. And this is the natural law of governance. When perceptions distort, as it always will under fatigue or stress, only shared structures can bring both parties back to the same page. Governance holds the memory of what you both agreed to. What would be measured, what would be required, what would be considered progress, and what happens when one person no longer feels aligned. It is the architecture that protects mutual clarity, especially when emotional weather shifts. When governance is missing, well, then you get emotional overwhelm disguised as disagreement. You get professional overfunctioning. You get policy decisions like refunds, scope, or service boundaries made in the heat of rupture, not the clarity of design. You hear, I just don't feel like it was worth it. Or, I thought this would feel different by now. Or, I didn't know we weren't allowed to stop. But what's missing isn't kindness or intention. It's the map you both were supposed to share. What this principle suggests instead is governance isn't about control. It's about stability in motion. Yeah? That means you're introducing an agreement, not as a legal paperwork, but as a working partnership, saying this isn't about rules, it's about clarity. When both feel tired or unsure, we know how to reset together. Yeah. Naming how success will be measured, how struggle will be handled, and how both parties can revisit the work without conflict, including your professional boundaries, refund policy, disengagement thresholds, and decision protocols. Because when ruptures come, and it always does, structure lets you lead without defending. Okay. With all of that, I've got reflection questions for you. In your past cases, did you ever have to explain your own policy in a moment of emotional pressure? I bet you have. What would it have changed if the agreement had already spoken for you? Here's one thing you can do. At the start of your next case, say, this agreement is a way for both of us to name what we are bringing, what we're building, and how we'll hold steady when things wobble, which they always will. Because in this work, you can't always prevent disappointment, but you can prevent disorientation. And that's what the governance is for. Okay, principle 12, equifinality. One of my favorite words. You'll hear me talk about this quite often. Equifinality, the freedom to reach the goal more than one way. I love this because so many people in our field are so rigid. And even when we're talking to a potential competitor, we're always like, well, I do it this way. And you're saying, well, I do it this way. And it's like, but you're still getting to the same outcome if you're working force-free, fear-free, and in a compassionate method, right? And that's because equifinality is in play. It's the freedom to reach a goal in more than one way. So let's take a look back into our story and a specific case. Now, it started with the drapes. So when they were first starting, Remy was reacting to every dog that passed the apartment window, pacing, barking, whining. But the time they reached the front door, his system had already redlined, right? So Taylor suggested they block the visual trigger for a while, just during decompression. She said, let's try closing the drapes for 2 weeks. We're not removing the world. We're giving his system a break, a chance to come down, so we can build it back better. But Jasmine hesitated. She said, I don't want to live in a cave. I already feel like I'm losing my freedom, and I love the light. And that's when Taylor paused, because what Jasmine was saying wasn't a lack of compliance. It wasn't pushback. It was data. It was her system saying, this intervention doesn't work for me. So instead of defending the method, Taylor does what canine neurobiological system science always does. She returned to the outcome. She said, okay, so what's the goal here? We want Remy to have a fewer surges during the day. Yeah. And we want decompression. We want his stress system to reset. And then she added, what else might help us to get there? And Jasmine, the person who had resisted the first suggestion, said, could I buy some temporary frost for the lower half of the window instead? That way he can see the street, but I still get some light. It would be temporary and I could take it down later. Taylor said, that's perfect, because the outcome stayed the same, but the path had changed and the plan got better because it belonged to both of them. Now, Stephen Covey once said, people build what they help create. Powerful words. What you might have noticed in your own cases is you offered a solution and the caregiver pushes back, right? You sense they're reacting emotionally, not logically, and you're tempted to explain it harder or soften the ask. You forget that the goal is decompression, not obedience to a method. That's the signal to shift gears, not seek compliance to your way or the highway. How many times I've heard that? This is the natural law of equifinality. Complex systems, whether dogs or humans, require flexible paths. If you hold too tightly to your method, you'll lose the human before you, and you'll lose them before you ever reach the outcome. When equifinality is missing, plans break when caregivers hit resistance. Options get mistaken for ultimatums. The shared goals become your goals, not the caregiver's goals. Accountability shifts to you, not to shared accountability. Progress halts because, not because it's impossible, but because no one believed there was more than one way. You hear, I can't do this. I don't want to live like this anymore. If this is what it takes, I'm out. But what if they're really saying is, I need a different road? So what this principle suggests instead is own the outcome, but flex the path. That means framing strategies as brainstorming, not prescriptive. Saying, here's one idea to meet the outcome, but it's not the only one. Inviting the caregiver into the creative thinking process to get to that outcome. Protecting the dog's system without triggering collapse in the human. Because co-creation isn't just respectful, it's effective. And it makes building something that lasts so much easier. And it makes buy-in a breeze. It really does. So here's your reflection question. Have you ever lost a case because the path felt too heavy, even when the outcome was still deeply wanted? Here's one thing you can do. In your next case, write the goal like this. Our outcome, X. Path A, suggest route. Path B, C, D, still open. Let's discover them together. Because equifinality isn't about having a perfect plan. It's about staying open so the plan can stay alive. Principle 13, we're nearly there. Principle 13 is emotional scaffolding. The supports that hold the human through the discomfort of change. So back to our story. In this case, Jasmine was still showing up. The plan was lighter now, and the pressure was off. But one week, she said this. Sometimes I feel like I'm failing him. Like, if I was stronger, this wouldn't be so hard. Taylor didn't correct her, didn't say, you're not failing. She asked instead, who's helping hold you through this? Well, that was a pause. I mean, Jasmine, there was just a moment for Jasmine. She said, no one, just me. And Taylor realized they had built the plan. They had clarified the goals. They had honored Remy's decompression, but they hadn't built scaffolding for Jasmine's emotions, her grief, her guilt, her quiet panic. So they added it in. They mapped out what Jasmine needed during hard moments, like a friend to call after an event, a 5-minute journaling cue, a podcast episode to play on our walks. One session a month that wasn't about training, but about checking in. Because dogs need regulation, but humans need resilient structures. And sometimes the thing that makes a case fall apart isn't behavioral complexity, it's emotional isolation. What you might have noticed in your own cases is the caregiver keeps doing the work, but sounds flatter, more brittle. They never celebrate progress, only worry about what's next. And they may show up at a session like it's an exam. You get the sense they're enduring, not engaging. But sometimes the emotional strain doesn't come from the work itself. It comes from inside the home. You'll hear, my partner says this is taking over our life. Or, my kids are tired of hearing me talk about the dog. Or, they keep saying he's just being bad and I should just stop babying him. These aren't just inconvenient comments. They are systemic undermining forces. And unless they're named, they can quietly dissolve a caregiver's belief in the process. That's why part of emotional scaffolding is not just individual support, it's relational containment. Sometimes that means things like offering a script for a caregiver to share with a family, hosting a single family session to explain the model, or simply validating that the caregiver is swimming against the current and needs more support, not more discipline. Because no one can hold emotional weight when the ground beneath them is shaking. That's where emotional scaffolding should have been built. And that is the law of emotional scaffolding. No one builds something hard without something else to lean on. When you ask someone to change how they live, love, or lead, you must also offer something that holds them while that change unfolds. When emotional scaffolding is missing, the human appears compliant, but they're eroding. They look responsible, but they're grieving alone. You get hidden shame, surface obedience, and eventual dropout. You hear, I should be further along by now. I know it's working, but I'm exhausted. I feel like I'm the problem. I didn't tell anyone we were doing this. I didn't want to be judged. But what you're really hearing is, this is too heavy and no one's holding me. What this principle suggests instead is you don't need to be a therapist, but you do need to ask who's helping them hold this. That means normalizing the emotional weight of change, building touch points for self-validation, reflection, or relief, asking in the intake, when this gets hard, and it will, who will you talk to? And offering your sessions as a scaffolded space, not just instructional hours, because emotional infrastructure isn't fluff. It's load bearing. Okay, so here's your reflection questions on this one. When was the last time you asked your client how they were holding up? Not in terms of the plan, but in terms of their own inner experience. And here's one thing you can do. In your next session, add this check-in. On a scale of 1 to 10, how heavy does this feel today? And what do you need more of to keep going? Because we can't ask people to carry the work if they haven't asked what's carrying them. Okay, the final one, principle 14, boundaries, the containment structure that allows the work to unfold. In this case, in the story that we have, let's talk about the final 2 weeks. Taylor had done the work. She had held the plan. She had protected the outcomes. She had repaired the wobbles. She had tracked the metrics. She'd honored Jasmine's voice. And then Jasmine sent another message. My sister's in town next week, and things were being ridiculous. She wants to take Remy on a real walk. I know we're avoiding that route right now, but I think I'll let her try just to prove he can handle it. Taylor paused. Because this wasn't about the walk, it was about boundaries. It was about the membrane that protects the fragile work from systems that don't understand it. And she didn't say no. She said, you're allowed to set boundaries around what this dog needs. You don't need to justify the protocol. You don't need to prove anything to your sister. And then she added, but I have boundaries too. If Remy's safety plans gets overridden during the next phase, I won't be able to continue tracking progress because the conditions we agreed to will no longer be in place. So Jasmine sat with that. And then she said, thank you. I needed permission to protect what we've built. And just like that, the container held. What you might have noticed in your own cases is a family member undermining your work. The caregiver says it's just easier than arguing with their partner. You find yourself adjusting your plans to avoid pushback. You start resenting the way your expertise is being bent around convenience. This is the moment boundaries are either strengthened or everything begins to leak. It's a natural law of boundaries. No meaningful change work can exist without protective edges. Boundaries are the walls that let trust deepen, the rules that allow effort to matter, the structure that keeps vulnerability from being punished. So when boundaries are missing, you see resentment, leakage, and over-accommodation. You get plan drift disguised as flexibility. Caregivers collapse inward. Professionals bend outward. And the dog, the one you're trying to help, becomes the battleground between unspoken family power dynamics. You'll hear, "It's fine, I'll just do it myself. I'm too tired to fight about it. It's not worth the argument. They just don't get it." And that's true. But what's more true is there was no boundaries to hold the truth in the first place. So what this principle suggests instead is boundaries must be declared, respected, and protected before they're violated. That means supporting caregivers to name boundaries around routines, decisions, and noise. Naming your own. Here's what I can track, support, or endorse. And here's what I can't. Framing limits not as rejection, but as containment. Holding space for disagreement without compromising safety. Because boundaries are not barriers, they're protection for the possible. So here are your final reflection questions. In your last 5 cases, did the real rupture happen when a boundary was crossed and no one knew it had even been drawn? And here's one thing you can do. During case setup, say, let's name a few boundaries we both want to hold. So if things get messy, we're not inventing limits in the heart of the moment, because safety is shared. Efforts can deepen. And that's the kind of container change can actually grow in. You've just walked through 14 natural principles. These principles are everywhere in climate science, in AI alignment, in couples therapy, in organizational collapse, because change is everywhere. And whenever change is attempted, they apply. They're universal. But most of us were never taught them. We learn to track behavior, to offer steps, to adapt plans, not to build systems that can hold a human being. Trying. So here's what I want to say. If this episode felt familiar, if Jasmine's voice sounded like someone you've worked with, and even like yourself in a hard season, then it may be time to assess not just how well you help dogs, but how well your system is helping you. And I'm introducing the Canine Neurobiological System Science, CNSS, Professional Practice Assessment. We built a tool for you. And it isn't a quiz, and it's not a scorecard. It's a diagnostic map for your own case design system. And it's included as part of our CNSS membership library, along with principle maps, practitioner interviews, and extended teaching episodes like this one. And our patrons, you're the reason this work gets live to the world. So thank you for investing in this science, for standing in the complexity, and for building systems of change that don't fall apart when people do. That's it for now. Look forward to seeing you again. Bye for now.